My name is Marin Ashford, and I was given exactly 60 minutes to pack my life and run before the executioner's axe would sever my head from my shoulders. Banished, cast out by Alpha Gareth into the freezing medieval winter to die alone. The entire pack gathered to mock me as the hourglass was turned. I was supposed to be weeping, begging for mercy at the heavy iron gates of Frostpine's fortress. But I wasn't, because what Gareth didn't know was that I had sent a raven 3 days ago, and the Alpha King had been waiting in the forest camps just beyond the border. He would arrive in 40 minutes. The stone floor of the Great Hall was so cold it felt like walking on jagged ice. It was the winter of 1432, and the Frostpine-packed territory in the Montana wilderness was buried under a relentless frost that had already claimed the lives of the weak. I knelt in the center of the dais, my thin linen dress offering no protection against the biting draft that swept through the high-arched windows. My wrists were bound with iron chains that bit into my skin, rubbed raw and bleeding from the guards' rough handling. Before me sat Alpha Gareth Stoneclaw. He was a man built like a fortress, with broad shoulders clad in thick bear pelts and a crown of twisted silver branches resting upon his dark hair streaked with early gray. For 3 years I had served as his pack's chief healer, mending their broken bones, delivering their pups, and brewing tonics to stave off the winter fever that swept through our territories every season. But today none of that mattered. Today I was a traitor. Standing beside Gareth's throne, a venomous smile playing on her lips, was Lady Seraphina Ravencrest. She was the daughter of the wealthiest lord in the neighboring eastern valleys, a purebred wolf with lineage as flawless as her pale skin and golden hair that fell in perfect waves down her back. She was also Gareth's chosen mate, bound to him not by the sacred mate bond, but by a contract sealed with 50 wagons of winter grain that had saved Frostpine from starvation 2 seasons prior. And she despised me. She despised me because I was an orphaned Omega, an outsider with no family name, to claim no dowry, to offer no noble blood running through my veins. Yet I held the respect of the common pack members, the mothers whose children I'd saved, the warriors, whose wounds I'd closed, the elders whose pain I'd eased. More importantly, she despised me because she knew deep in her calculating heart that Gareth's eyes had once lingered on me before her father bought his loyalty with that mountain of grain. Marin Ashford of nowhere, boomed the voice of Elder Rowan Greystone, the grizzled pack elder who stood to Gareth's right. His voice echoed against the high vaulted ceilings, silencing the murmurs of the gathered crowd that packed the hall from wall to wall. You have been brought before the Alpha's justice on charges of high treason, witchcraft, and the attempted poisoning of the pack's winter reserves. The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd known they were coming. I'd watched this trap being set for weeks, seen the pieces moving into place like stones on a game board. But hearing the accusations spoken aloud in front of everyone I'd served and protected still made my stomach clench with rage and helplessness. I did no such thing, I protested, my voice echoing back, desperate and raw. The nightshade found in my apothecary was for treating the elder's joint pain, not for poisoning the grain silos. I am a healer, not a murderer. Silence! Gareth roared, his alpha command rolling over the room like a physical wave of pressure. Several weaker wolves whimpered and dropped their gazes, unable to withstand the force of his dominance. The command crashed against my own will, trying to force submission to make me bare my throat and accept his judgment without question. I forced my chin up, refusing to submit, my eyes locking with his cold gray ones. There was no mercy in his gaze, only a calculated indifference that told me he had already made his choice. He had weighed my life against Seraphina's satisfaction and found me wanting. Seraphina leaned down, whispering poison into his ear, her delicate hand resting possessively on his chest. Even from where I knelt, I could see the satisfied curve of her smile, the gleam of triumph in her golden eyes. We found the crushed leaves mixed into the barley sacks in the lower cellars. Elder Rowan continued unrolling a heavy parchment that supposedly contained evidence of my crimes. Lady Seraphina's personal guards discovered it during a routine inspection yesterday morning. Had she not been so vigilant, half the pack would have perished by the next full moon from the poison you so carefully prepared. It was a flawless frame job executed with the precision of a military campaign. Seraphina's guards, specifically a brute named Caspian Flint, had ransacked my apothecary while I was in the forest, gathering pine needles for a breathing tonic 2 days ago. They had planted the evidence, sealed my fate, and secured Seraphina's undisputed reign as Luna of Frostpine, removing the only woman in the pack who might challenge her influence over Gareth. I have served this pack faithfully for 3 years, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady tremor that somehow carried to every corner of the silent hall. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the people I had saved, the families I had helped, the wolves whose lives I had touched. I looked at Alara Whitlock, whose 7-year-old son I had pulled from the frozen river last spring, breathing life back into his blue lips until he coughed and gasped and lived. She looked away, shame coloring her weathered face. I looked at old Henrik, whose failing sight I had preserved with careful treatments of eyebright and fennel, allowing him to see his grandchildren's faces for 3 more precious years. He stared at his boots, unable to meet my gaze. Fear of the Alpha outweighed their gratitude. Fear of Seraphina's retribution kept their mouths shut. In this moment, I understood with brutal clarity that loyalty meant nothing when weighed against survival. Gareth, I said, using his name without his title, a final small rebellion. You know I would never harm this pack. You know what I am. Gareth finally stood, his massive frame unfolding from the carved wooden throne that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. He walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, his heavy leather boots echoing on the stone floor like a death knell. He stopped just inches away, looking down at me as if I were a diseased rat that had crawled into his hall. You are a stray Maren, Gareth sneered, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear, performing for his pack and his future Luna. I took you in out of pity when you stumbled into our territory 3 years ago, half-starved and desperate. And this is how you repay my generosity, by plotting to murder my people out of petty jealousy toward my future Luna. The lie was so complete, so thoroughly constructed, that I almost admired the artistry of it. Almost. Seraphina stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on Gareth's arm, with perfect timing, her voice dripping with false compassion. Be merciful, my Alpha. She is but a lowly, misguided creature. Do not stain your hands with her blood today. Banishment is a fate fitting for a rat. Let the winner take her. It was a cruel mercy, and everyone in the hall knew it. Banishment in the dead of winter in the northern territories was a guaranteed death sentence. The rogue wolves that hunted the borderlands, the freezing temperatures that could kill in hours, the starvation that awaited anyone without a pack's protection. It was an execution disguised as a pardon, and it allowed Gareth to maintain the fiction of his own benevolence. Gareth nodded slowly, turning to the massive hourglass that sat upon the elder's table. The glass was as tall as a man's torso, filled with dark red sand that looked like dried blood. He reached out with both hands and forcefully turned it over the heavy base, scraping against the wood. The sand began to pour through the narrow glass neck with a soft, sinister whisper. You have 1 hour, Marin Ashford, Gareth decreed, his voice booming with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. 60 minutes to gather whatever meager belongings you can carry. When the last grain of sand falls, you are no longer of Frostpine. If you are found within my borders after the hour is up, my guards will hunt you down and mount your head on a pike at the gates as a warning to all who would betray their Alpha. Cut her loose, he ordered. Caspian Flint stepped forward from his position behind Seraphina, drawing a heavy iron key from his belt. He was a thick-necked brute with scarred knuckles and cold eyes that had looked at me with unconcealed hatred since the day Seraphina had brought him into the pack. He unlocked my chains with rough efficiency, and they fell to the cold stone with a sharp clang that echoed like a closing gate. I rubbed my bleeding wrists, slowly feeling the torn skin sting as air hit the wounds. Rising to my feet took every ounce of dignity I had left. My legs shook, but I forced them steady. The hall was dead silent, hundreds of eyes watching to see if I would break, if I would beg. Your time is ticking, stray, Seraphina whispered as I passed her. Her voice pitched low, so only I could hear. Her golden eyes flashed with malicious triumph. I suggest you run. I didn't weep. I didn't beg. I looked at Gareth one last time, memorizing the face of the man who was throwing me to the wolves, completely unaware of the monstrous storm he had just invited to his doorstep. Then I turned on my heel and walked out of the great hall, my spine straight, my head high, the countdown echoing in my mind. 60 minutes, 59, 58. The courtyard was a sea of gray snow and biting wind that cut through my thin dress like knives. Pack members parted for me as I walked toward the lower bailey, where my modest quarters waited, whispering insults behind their hands, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Someone threw a clump of icy mud that struck my shoulder, but I didn't flinch. My mind was entirely focused on the mathematics of survival. 45 minutes to the border, 15 minutes to pack. Time enough. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my apothecary with trembling hands. It was a modest stone room, barely larger than a storage closet, but it had been mine. The scent of dried rosemary blood, moss, and damp earth usually welcomed me like an old friend. Today it smelled of violation and destruction. The shelves had been ransacked by Seraphina's men during their evidence gathering. Glass vials lay shattered on the floor, their precious contents soaking into the dirt. Rare herbs I'd spent months collecting were trampled and ruin ground into the stone by careless boots. My mortars were overturned, my carefully labeled jars scattered and broken. I ignored the mess and moved straight to the loose stone beneath the hearth, the one I discovered in my first week here. Prying it up with fingers that ached from the cold, I pulled out a heavy leather-bound satchel. It was already packed. I hadn't just been waiting for the axe to fall, I had been preparing for it. For weeks I had noticed the shift in Gareth's demeanor, the way his eyes slid past me as if I'd become invisible. I'd heard the whispers behind my back, felt the change in the air, like a coming storm. I'd watched Seraphina's guards trail me in the woods, their presence too obvious to be mere coincidence. I had known my days in Frostpine were numbered from the moment Seraphina had looked at me with calculation in her eyes, instead of simple disdain. But what none of them knew, what I guarded more fiercely than my own life, was the secret I carried. 38 minutes. I pulled a thick woolen cloak from the chest at the foot of my narrow cot and fastened it around my shoulders with fingers that had steadied now that I had purpose. Reaching into the secret compartment of my satchel, my fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled it out into the dim light of the dying fire. It was a massive pendant made of pure black obsidian, bound in molten silver that had been worked into intricate, spiraling patterns. Etched into the stone was a crest I'd memorized every detail of during long nights of remembering a snarling direwolf crowned with thorns, its eyes set with twin rubies that caught the firelight and seemed to glow with inner flame. The royal seal of the Alpha King. My mind flashed back 3 months to late autumn, when the leaves had just begun to turn and the first frost hadn't yet hardened the ground. I had been foraging deep in the forbidden territory near the jagged peaks of the Blood Mountains, searching for a rare white moss that grew only on the north face of certain rocks. The area was forbidden for good reason. It marked the boundary between packed territories and the wild lands where rogue wolves and worse things hunted. There I had found a man. He was massive, even collapsed and bleeding into the freezing rain. The wounds that covered his body were deep and jagged, the kind that came from a coordinated ambush by multiple attackers who knew exactly where to strike. He was bleeding out his life, pouring into the mud in steady pulses that matched his weakening heartbeat. His wolf was fighting to surface, trying to force a shift that would heal the damage, but I could see immediately why it couldn't. The wounds were laced with silver, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to prevent his wolf from taking over, keeping him trapped in his vulnerable human form while he bled to death. I should have left him. A lone Omega in forbidden territory, finding a strange man who'd clearly been the target of an assassination attempt, every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run. But I'd knelt beside him anyway, pressing my hands against the worst of the wounds, and that's when I'd seen his eyes. Even clouded with pain and blood loss, they held a silver ring around the iris that I'd only read about in the oldest texts, the absolute mark of royal alpha blood. For 3 days I hid him in a forgotten cave I discovered during my herb-gathering expeditions. For 3 days I dug the silver out of his flesh with my bare hands, feeling the metal burn my skin, as I extracted shard after shard from wounds that should have killed him a dozen times over. I chewed bitter roots raw to create poultices, pressing them against his chest, while he burned with fever hot enough that I feared his brain would cook. On the 4th night, his fever broke. He opened his eyes, and for the first time he truly saw me. "My name is Theron Ironheart," he'd said, his voice rough from disuse and screaming. "Alpha King of the Northern Reaches." He'd paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel exposed. "Who are you, little wolf, to pull a king from death's door?" "Maren," I'd whispered. "Just Maren." He didn't just thank me. Before I could pull back, he grabbed my wrist with a hand that was surprisingly gentle despite its size and the strength that was already returning to his body. He pulled me closer, inhaling deeply at the curve of my neck where my scent was strongest. A low, possessive rumble vibrated through his ribs and into my chest where we touched. I felt it in my bones, in my blood, in the very core of my being. "Mine," he had growled, and in that single word I felt the snap of recognition, the click of something sliding into place like a key in a lock. The mate bond, the one connection that couldn't be forged or faked or bought with grain shipments. The rarest gift the moon goddess could bestow, and she'd given it to an orphaned Omega and a king. Theron had been forced to leave 2 days later, still healing but unable to stay hidden any longer. He'd given me the pendant, pressing it into my hands with both of his wrapped around mine. "I have to return to the capital," he'd said, his silver eyes burning into mine. "There are traitors in my court, wolves, who knew my route and set that ambush. I need to find them and end them before they can strike again." He'd cupped my face, then his thumb tracing my cheekbone with unexpected tenderness. But I will come back for you, Marin. When the first snow falls, I will come with an army to claim you properly before your pack and mine. He'd pressed his lips to my forehead, a promise sealed with touch. If anyone ever threatens you, send word. I will raise the territory to the ground to reach you. 3 days ago, when Serafina had first publicly accused me of stealing from the pack treasury, a preliminary accusation that had been quickly resolved, but had served as a clear warning of what was coming, I had known the end was near. I'd bribed a traveling merchant with my mother's last silver ring, the only thing of value I owned besides the pendant, to carry a raven to the royal capital. The message had been simple. The stray is cornered. Come quickly. 38 minutes had passed since Gareth turned the hourglass. I checked the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. The sky was the color of bruised iron, heavy with unfallen snow. The wind was picking up, howling through the cracks in the stone walls like wolves crying for blood. 22 minutes remained before Gareth's guards would be released to hunt me. But Theron had promised 40 minutes travel time from the border encampments where he'd been waiting with his army since receiving my raven 3 days prior. He should have arrived 2 minutes ago. Had something gone wrong? Had the message not reached him? Had he been unable to mobilize in time? I felt the first flutter of real fear, but I crushed it down. I had survived this long by being practical, by planning, by refusing to give in to despair, even when it would have been easier to just lie down and let the cold take me. I slid the heavy obsidian pendant beneath my dress, feeling the cold stone settle against my racing heart like a second heartbeat. I strapped a hunting knife to my thigh with practiced efficiency. The blade was small but wicked sharp, a gift from old Henrik during a summer when I'd taught his granddaughter the basics of herbalism. I slung the satchel over my shoulder, feeling the weight of the herbs and supplies I'd packed weeks ago. I didn't need to pack food for a long journey. I just needed to survive until Theron arrived, if he arrived. I stepped out of the apothecary for the last time and locked the door behind me, then dropped the iron key into the snow. Let Serafina have the ruined room. Let her pick through the broken glass and trampled herbs, looking for secrets she'd never find. Caspian Flint and 3 other guards approached me across the courtyard, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They were grinning, anticipating entertainment. This was sport to them. Time's almost up, witch, Caspian sneered, grabbing my upper arm with bruising force. His fingers dug into the muscle hard enough to leave marks. Let's take a walk to the boundary line. Wouldn't want you to get lost and accidentally stay within pack territory now, would we? I didn't resist as they marched me toward the main gates. Resistance would only give them an excuse to be rougher, and I needed to conserve my strength. The entire pack had gathered along the battlements, and in the courtyard, a sea of hostile faces hungry for the spectacle of my exile. Gareth and Serafina stood on the high balcony overlooking the gates, watching my humiliation with smug satisfaction. Serafina's arm was looped through Gareth's, her head resting on his shoulder in a calculated display of united authority. As we reached the massive wooden doors bound with iron, the heavy bars were lifted by guards on either side. The gates groaned open on ancient hinges, revealing the vast, endless expanse of the snow-covered forest that stretched beyond Frostpine's walls. The wind hit me like a physical blow, cutting through my cloak and dress like they were made of paper. The temperature had dropped even further. This was killing cold, the kind that would freeze flesh in minutes and stop hearts in hours. "Keep walking, Maren," one of the guards barked, shoving me forward into the knee-deep snow that had drifted against the walls. I stumbled, but caught myself refusing to fall. I stood in the threshold, balanced between the packlands behind me and the wilderness ahead. The boundary line of Frostpine territory was marked 50 yards ahead by standing stones carved with pack symbols. Once I crossed that line, I would be rogue, no pack, no protection, no rights. Fair game for anyone who wanted to hunt me. I looked back at the hourglass, visible through the open doors of the great hall, elevated on its table so all could see. The red sand had nearly finished draining through the narrow neck. 38 minutes had passed. "I said, keep moving," Caspian yelled, raising his hand to strike me. Before his hand could fall, the ground beneath our feet shuddered. It started as a low vibration, a hum deep within the frozen earth that rattled the snow from the pine trees in the surrounding forest. Then it became a rhythmic, thundering thud. Thud. Thud, like the heartbeat of some massive creature rising from beneath the ground. The mocking laughter in the courtyard abruptly ceased. The guards holding their axes lowered them slowly, their eyes widening in confusion as they tried to identify the source of the sound. Up on the balcony, Gareth frowned, stepping forward and peering into the tree line with a hand shading his eyes from the glare of snow. "What is that?" he demanded. "I don't know, Alpha," one of the sentries called back, his voice tight with uncertainty. Seraphina's smug smile faltered. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden unease. The watcher in the high tower blew the warning horn, a long, frantic blast that signaled an incoming force of significant size. The sound cut through the air like a blade, sharp and urgent. Panic rippled through the pack like wind through grass. Wolves began to shift, the sounds of bones cracking and reforming, skin splitting, to allow fur to burst through, echoing across the courtyard as defenders prepared for what they assumed must be a raid. But this was no raid. From the dense, fog-shrouded forest beyond the boundary stones, shadows began to emerge. Massive shapes that moved with predatory grace, despite their size, materialized from the gray mist like nightmares taking solid form. Armored direwolves, each one twice the size of even Frostpine's largest warriors, stepped into the clearing. They were clad in blackened steel plate armor that had been custom forged to fit their massive frames, and their breath steamed in the cold air like dragons waking from ancient sleep. There were hundreds of them, forming a perfect, terrifying semicircle around the gates of the fortress in a coordinated movement that spoke of extensive military training. Then came the banners. Heavy silk dyed the color of dried blood, each one bearing the same symbol I wore hidden against my heart, a black direwolf crowned with thorns, rendered in thread of gold that caught the weak winter's sunlight. The collective gasp from the Frostpine pack was deafening. "The Alpha King's Royal Guard," someone whispered, and the words spread through the crowd like wildfire. "The Alpha King is here." They had not been seen in this province for over a century. Their presence here now was unprecedented. Gareth's face went completely pale, all the blood draining from his features in an instant. He shoved Seraphina aside roughly, nearly sending her stumbling, and practically sprinted down the stone stairs from the balcony. He shifted mid-run into his beta form to move faster, desperate to reach the gates and greet the unexpected royalty before giving offense. "Stand down! Stand down!" Gareth roared at his men, who were shivering in barely controlled terror at the sheer suffocating dominance radiating from the royal army. The pressure of their combined alpha auras was crushing, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to think of resistance. The ranks of the giant direwolves parted with military precision. Riding forth on a beast so large it looked like a monster from ancient myth was Theron Ironheart. He wore a heavy cloak of black bear fur over darkened steel plate armor that had been worked with the same thorned wolf pattern as his banners. His face was a mask of absolute lethal calm, but his eyes, those terrifying glowing silver eyes, were burning with a rage that seemed to actually heat the freezing air around him. He pulled the reins of his mount, and the massive direwolf stopped exactly 10 feet from where I stood in the snow, still held by Caspian's bruising grip on my arm. Gareth arrived at the gates mere seconds later, his chest heaving from his sprint. He instantly dropped to his knees in the slush, pressing his forehead to the frozen ground in the deepest sign of submission and respect. The rest of the pack followed his lead like dominoes, falling hundreds of wolves, dropping to their knees in waves until only I remained standing. I couldn't kneel. Caspian still had hold of my arm, and I was frozen in place by the sight of Theron, by the reality of him here now, exactly when I'd needed him. "Your Majesty," Gareth shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate hospitality. "King Theron, we had no warning of your arrival. The Frostpine pack is honored, deeply honored, to host you in our humble territory. Had we known you were coming, we would have prepared a feast, gathered the tribute-readied chambers." Theron didn't even glance at Gareth. His silver eyes were locked onto mine with the focus of a predator sighting prey, and in that gaze I saw everything. I saw his fury at my bloodied wrists, at the bruises on my face from Caspian's rough handling, at the thinness of my cloak against the killing cold. I saw his recognition of how close he'd cut this timing, but I also saw his relief. He'd made it. We'd made it. The king let out a low, vibrating growl that made the stone walls of the fortress tremble. The sound resonated in my chest, in my bones, in every cell of my body. Several of Gareth's guards whimpered and pressed themselves flat against the snow, unable to handle the king's crushing aura at full force. Theron swung down from his mount in one fluid motion of lethal grace. He didn't walk toward me. He stalked each step, deliberate, and controlled, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. The sound was the only noise in the absolute silence that had fallen over the courtyard. Gareth peeked up from his prostration, confusion warping his features as he watched the king ignore him completely. "Your Grace," he tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "Please do not trouble yourself with this criminal. She is a banished stray, a would-be poisoner. We were just casting her out according to pack law." Silence. Theron's command was not loud. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The word held such absolute ancient power. the weight of 1,000 years of royal bloodline and divine authority, that Gareth's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. The Alpha couldn't have spoken another word if his life depended on it. Theron stopped right in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. He reached out with both hands, and Caspian's grip on my arm vanished so quickly I almost stumbled. The guard had released me and scrambled backward like I'd suddenly caught fire. Theron's massive gloved hands gently took my face, his touch impossibly tender for someone who radiated such deadly intent. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones with reverent care. "You are freezing," he murmured, his voice softening only for me, a stark contrast to the monster he presented to the world. This voice was for me alone, intimate and warm. "Your lips are blue, little bird." Despite everything, the fear, the cold, the hundreds of watching eyes, I felt a small trembling smile break across my face. "You're late," I whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "I gave you an hour. It took you 40 minutes. A dark, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of Theron's mouth, transforming his face from coldly beautiful to devastating. "My apologies," he said, his voice still pitched low. "Your raven reached me 3 days ago at the capital. I rode hard to the border camp, staged the army in the pine forest just beyond your Alpha's patrol range. When my scouts reported the trial had begun this morning, I gave the order to march." His thumb traced the curve of my jaw. 40 minutes from the forest line to these gates. The snow drifts slowed the horses, or I would have arrived sooner. "Are you hurt?" "I've been better," I admitted. My wrists throbbed where the shackles had cut, and I could feel bruises forming on my arm from Caspian's grip, but nothing was broken. Nothing that wouldn't heal. Theron's eyes tracked to my bleeding wrists, and the temperature around us seemed to drop another 10 degrees as his fury crystallized into something sharp and deadly. But his hands remained gentle as he unclasped his heavy fur-lined royal cloak and wrapped it around my shoulders. The cloak was enormous on me, dragging on the ground, but it held his heat and his scent. Pine smoke and winter wind, and something fundamentally him that made my wolf settle and purr for the first time in months. He pulled me against his chest, one arm banding around my back to hold me steady, and pressed a firm kiss into my hair. Behind us, Gareth let out a choked sound of utter disbelief. Your Majesty," he stammered, the words barely coherent. "What is the meaning of this? That woman is a traitor to my pack. She poisoned our grain stores. Theron turned slowly, keeping one arm wrapped tightly around my waist so I remained tucked against his side. The soft, gentle king who had just been cradling my face vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, replaced once again by the winter scythe, the name soldiers whispered around campfires, the name that made enemy packs surrender before a single blow was struck. He looked down at Gareth, who was still kneeling in the mud with a gaze that promised nothing but slaughter. "This woman," Theron's voice echoed, carrying across the silent, terrified courtyard to reach every single pack member gathered on the walls and in the bailey, "is Marin Ironheart, my fated mate, the queen of the northern reaches." The silence that followed Theron's declaration was so complete that I could hear the wind whistling through the battlements, the nervous shift of paws on stone, the rapid thundering of my own heartbeat. Serafina, who had just reached the courtyard after descending from the balcony, stumbled backward as if she'd been struck. She let out a horrified shriek that shattered the stillness. No, that's not possible. She's a stray. She's nobody." The guards who had just been dragging me to my exile dropped their weapons. The axes and swords clattered against the frozen ground as their faces drained of all blood, understanding flooding in as they realized what they'd done. They had laid hands on the Alpha King's fated mate. They had shackled her, bruised her, dragged her through the snow like a criminal. In the old laws, the ones that still held power in the Lycan courts, that was a crime punishable by death. Theron stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive broadsword. The blade was still sheathed, but the threat was clear. "And I smell her blood on your stones, Gareth," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal purr. "I smell it on the shackles in your great hall. I smell it on that guard's hands." His eyes flicked to Caspian, who had gone so pale he looked like a corpse. "You gave my queen 1 hour to leave her home. Now I am giving you 1 minute to justify why I shouldn't burn this entire fortress to the ground and mount your head on my gates." The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the howling wind and the terrified, ragged breathing of the Frostpine pack. Several of the wolves who'd been watching from the battlements had fainted, unable to handle the pressure of the king's fury. Gareth remained frozen on his knees in the freezing slush, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the monstrous, black-armored king who held me. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? 6 seconds, Gareth, Theron murmured, his voice a low, lethal purr that vibrated right through my bones where I pressed against his side. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his alpha aura was pressing the lesser wolves' faces down into the snow, making them unable to even lift their heads to look at him. 5. Your Majesty, King Theron, I beg of you. Gareth finally found his voice, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. There has been a monstrous misunderstanding. A terrible mistake. The mighty alpha of Frostpine looked like a frightened pup, his carefully constructed authority crumbling like sand. The woman Maren, she was found guilty of high treason against this pack. We found crushed nightshade in our winter barley silos. We thought she meant to kill us all. If we had known she was your mate, if we had any idea. 50 seconds. Theron replied, his gaze unblinking and merciless. His arm tightened around my waist, pulling me impossibly closer. Seraphina, shivering in her luxurious velvet cloak, pushed herself up from the snow where she'd stumbled. Her golden hair was plastered to her face, her usual pristine elegance shattered by sheer terror. But her arrogance was a hard habit to break even in the face of certain death. My king, Seraphina interrupted, attempting a curtsy despite her violently trembling knees. I am Lady Seraphina Ravencrest. My father is Lord Aldrich Ravencrest of the Eastern Valleys. We have been loyal subjects to the crown for 3 generations. She gestured at me, her voice taking on a note of desperate pleading. I assure you my guards found the poison in her apothecary. She is a witch and a murderer. You must be under some sort of a spell to claim such a lowly stray as your... Theron didn't even draw his sword. He simply flicked his wrist in a gesture so slight I almost missed it. From the ranks of the massive royal direwolves, a scarred warrior with one dead white eye and a cloak made of silver fox fur lunged forward with the speed of a striking snake. Before Seraphina could finish her sentence, the warrior Dorian Blackfang, Theron's second-in-command, backhanded her with a steel gauntleted hand. The crack of metal against bone echoed off the stone walls like a whip strike. Seraphina shrieked and collapsed into the snow, a dark trail of blood immediately blooming from her split lip and broken nose. She sobbed, her hands covering her ruined face. Speak out of turn to your queen again, Ravencrest, Theron said coldly, not even looking at her. And I will let Dorian tear out your tongue with pliers before I hang you. Your father's name means nothing to me. Your loyalty means nothing to me. The only thing keeping you breathing right now is my curiosity about how deep your treason runs. He pulled me closer, his heavy cloak shielding me entirely from the biting wind. 40 seconds, Gareth. And so far, all I hear are the lies of a weak man trying to justify his own blindness. I looked down at Gareth, feeling a strange mix of pity and profound vindication. For 3 years I had bowed my head to this man. I had served his pack, saved his people, asked for nothing but shelter and the chance to practice my craft. Now he was groveling at my feet, and the power dynamic had reversed so completely that it felt like a different world than the one I'd woken up in this morning. It wasn't Nightshade, I said, my voice raspy from the cold but clear enough to carry in the dead silence. Theron looked down at me, the brutal harshness in his silver eyes softening just a fraction. He gave me a subtle nod, silently urging me to continue. The king was yielding the floor to his queen, showing the pack that my voice held weight, that my words mattered. The crushed leaves found in the barley silos? I continued, looking directly at Elder Rowan Greystone, who had condemned me less than an hour ago. You said they were dark and broad, yes, that they looked like Nightshade. Rowan nodded slowly, confusion clear on his weathered face. Yes, we found. But if anyone had bothered to consult me, I interrupted, my voice hardening, or if anyone had simply opened those burlap sacks and smelled them, you would have known it wasn't Nightshade. It was dried hemlock mixed with dark river ash to mimic the appearance of a healing herb. I let that sink in for a moment, watching realization dawn on Rowan's face. I am a master apothecary trained by the healer who raised me before she died. If I wanted to poison this pack, I wouldn't use something so bitter that wolves would immediately taste it in their ale and spit it out. I would use tasteless widow's lace, which has no scent and no flavor but stops the heart in minutes. Rowan blanched, his eyes widening as he realized the fatal flaw in their hasty judgment. Several other pack members who had expertise in herbs or healing began to murmur, understanding, spreading like ripples in water. Furthermore, I said, my gaze shifting to the ranks of trembling guards until I found Caspian Flint trying to shrink behind his comrades. The nightshade in my apothecary was whole root, kept in a sealed amber jar on the top shelf of the western wall. It's been there for 6 months untouched except during the autumn harvest, when I used precisely 3 roots to make a pain tonic for the elders. I pointed at him, my finger steady despite the cold. Caspian Flint claimed he found crushed leaves in my mortar during his inspection yesterday, but I haven't used that mortar in a week. I've been using the smaller one for grinding wintergreen. If he found crushed leaves in the large mortar, it's because he put them there himself. 30 seconds, Theron said, his silver eyes locking onto Caspian like a predator selecting prey. The guard let out a pathetic whimper, his knees buckling. He grabbed onto the shoulder of the wolf next to him to keep from falling. "She's lying," Caspian shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I found the evidence exactly where I said." "Bring him to me," Theron commanded, cutting through Caspian's protests. Dorian stepped into the terrified crowd of Frostpine guards with the casual confidence of a wolf among sheep. They scrambled out of his way, tripping over each other in their haste to avoid his attention. He grabbed Caspian by the back of his leather tunic and dragged him effortlessly across the courtyard like he weighed nothing, then threw him at Theron's feet hard enough that the guard's face hit the frozen ground with a sickening thud. "My king, please," Caspian sobbed, pressing his face into the mud and snow, his whole body shaking. "I was only following orders. I swear it on my life. I am a sworn sword of the Ravencrest estate. I do whatever my lady commands. I had no choice." "What did she command?" Theron asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. Caspian broke like thin ice under weight. She gave me the hemlock. Lady Seraphina wanted the healer gone." The words tumbled out in a rush, his face still pressed to the ground. The Alpha was growing too fond of her, spending too much time at the apothecary asking her opinion on pack matters. Seraphina said she needed the woman out of the way before the winter shipments arrived from her father, before the formal mating ceremony. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She gave me the crushed leaves already prepared. Told me to plant them in the grain stores and in the healer's apothecary. Make it look like Maren was preparing to poison the pack. I just did what I was paid to do. I swear it. I swear on my wolf I was only following orders." The collective gasp from the Frostpine pack was deafening. Betrayed by their future Luna, the woman who was supposed to protect and lead them. Several wolves turned to look at Seraphina with expressions of horror and rage. Gareth looked as though he had been struck by lightning. All the color drained from his face as he stared at Seraphina, his jaw slacked, the realization of her manipulation finally piercing through his thick skull and wounded pride. "Seraphina," Gareth whispered, his voice cracking like breaking ice. You poisoned our own winter reserves. You would have let our elders and pups die just to frame Maren, just to remove a rival." Seraphina scrambled backward in the snow, her eyes wild with panic, blood still streaming from her broken nose. "He's a liar," she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "A coward trying to save his own miserable skin, Gareth. My love, you can't believe a peasant guard over your chosen mate. He's lying to curry favor with the king." Theron raised one hand and the courtyard fell dead silent again. Even Seraphina's sobs cut off abruptly, as if someone had closed a hand around her throat. He looked at Gareth with an expression of utter disgust, the kind of look you'd give something foul you'd stepped in. "Time is up, Gareth Stoneclaw," the Alpha King decreed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "And you have proven yourself worse than a traitor. You are a fool." The wind howled through the battlements, carrying with it the undeniable scent of Seraphina's souring panic, fear, and desperation mixing with her expensive perfumes. The smug, untouchable noblewoman who had mocked me just 40 minutes ago was now crawling backward in the snow, frantically looking for an avenue of escape that didn't exist. Surrounding us were hundreds of the king's elite guard, their giant armored forms standing like statues of dark iron, completely still, except for the occasional shift of a massive paw or the steam of breath in the frozen air. Theron didn't move from my side. His hand rested firmly on my waist, grounding me, pouring his blazing body heat into my shivering frame, even through the layers of his cloak. I could feel the mate bond humming between us stronger now that we were touching like a golden thread pulled taut and thrumming with power. "King Theron," Gareth pleaded, his voice cracking as he finally found his courage, though it was entirely misplaced. He struggled to his feet, though he kept his head bowed in what he probably thought was a show of respect. "Lady Seraphina's crimes are severe. I will not defend them. She has betrayed my trust and endangered the safety of my pack." He swallowed hard, and I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle that would save his own skin. "But her father, Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, is a powerful ally to the crown. His grain shipments feed half the northern territories. His silver mines provide the crown's treasury. Surely we should wait for Lord Ravencrest to arrive, so that we may negotiate an appropriate punishment for his daughter's indiscretion." A dark, terrifying laugh rumbled in Theron's chest. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, that made my wolf whimper and press closer to him for protection, even though I knew that his fury was not directed at me. Negotiate, Theron repeated, tasting the word as if it were ash in his mouth. You think I came here to negotiate with the Ravencrests? He turned to Dorian, who had remained standing at attention nearby, his scarred face expressionless. Bring out the cargo. From the back of the royal procession, a heavy iron cage mounted on a horse-drawn wagon was pulled forward through the ranks of direwolves. The wheels groaned under the immense weight, cutting deep furrows in the snow. The wagon stopped in the center of the courtyard with a final lurch. Inside the rusted iron bars sat a man huddled in a filthy, tattered cloak that might once have been fine velvet, but was now stained with blood and excrement. He was missing his left arm. The stump was wrapped in bloody, dirty bandages that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. His face was gaunt with starvation, his aristocratic features bruised and broken, one eye swollen completely shut. Seraphina let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the stone walls. Father, Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, the wealthiest nobleman in the eastern valleys, the man whose grain shipments kept half the province alive through the brutal winters, raised his head slowly. His remaining eye focused on his daughter with an expression that held no warmth. No fatherly concern, only cold calculation. Gareth staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Lord Ravencrest, he gasped. What is the meaning of this? Why is a lord of the realm in a cage like a common criminal? Theron's voice when he spoke was colder than the winter wind cutting through the courtyard. Because your precious Lord Ravencrest Gareth is the architect of high treason against the crown. He stepped forward, and I moved with him, still tucked against his side. I could feel the fury radiating from him like heat from a forge barely contained beneath that mask of icy control. 3 months ago, Theron continued, his voice carrying clearly over the wind, reaching every single member of the pack. In the Blood Mountains north of here, my royal procession was ambushed. 30 of my finest guards were slaughtered in a coordinated attack. I was left for dead, poisoned with a rare silver-laced widow's extract that prevents shifting and accelerates bleeding. I stiffened against Theron's side, my mind racing back to the cave, to those 3 desperate days of pulling shard after shard of poisoned silver from his flesh, watching him burn with fever, certain that each labored breath would be his last. It took my spies 2 months, Theron said, his glowing silver eyes fixed on Gareth's shocked face, to track down the origin of that specific poison. The silver lacing technique is extremely rare, requiring specialized knowledge of both metallurgy and alchemy. Only 3 sources in the known territories have the capability to produce it. He paused, letting the tension build. The poison that nearly killed me was exclusively refined and traded by the Ravencrest estate. Your future father-in-law, Gareth, funded the mercenaries who tried to assassinate your king. He intended to destabilize the northern reaches to create chaos and a succession crisis so that he could seize control of the crown's silver mines during the resulting power vacuum. Theron looked down at me, his thumb gently stroking my hip through the layers of fabric in a gesture of tenderness that contrasted sharply with the deadly intent in his voice. If it weren't for my mate Maren, who found me bleeding out in a cave during one of her herb-gathering expeditions, who spent 3 days and nights pulling Ravencrest silver from my chest with her bare hands, while I burned with fever, I would be dead. The northern reaches would be in civil war, and Aldrich Ravencrest would be counting his profits. The entire Frostpine pack was staring at me now with absolute shock and dawning horror. The lowly orphaned healer they had just banished to the freezing woods, the woman they had watched be shackled and condemned, had saved the life of the Alpha King, had prevented a civil war, had protected the realm while they turned their backs on her. Elder Rowan looked like he was about to faint, his weathered face pale as snow. Seraphina knew, Theron said, his voice dropping into a register of pure lethal ice that made the temperature plummet. She knew her father's plot, and when Maren began asking questions about the missing winter shipments that Ravencrest had diverted to pay for his mercenaries and his poison, Seraphina panicked. His eyes locked onto the sobbing, bleeding woman in the snow. She realized that the healer she so despised was sharp enough, observant enough to unravel her father's treason if given time. So she framed her, planted evidence, manipulated her fool of an alpha into condemning an innocent woman to death. No, Seraphina sobbed, thrashing violently as 2 of Theron's royal guards grabbed her by the arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. I knew nothing of the ambush. I swear it on the moon goddess herself, I only wanted the stray gone because she was undermining my authority, making the pack question Gareth's choice of mate. I didn't know about father's plans. Liar! The shout came from the cage. Lord Aldrich had pulled himself to his feet, gripping the bars with his one remaining hand. "You knew everything, you stupid girl. I told you the king had to die before he could consolidate power with the Eastern families. I told you the healer was asking too many questions about the grain shipments that she needed to be silenced before she connected the dots." His aristocratic mask had completely crumbled, revealing the monster beneath a man who had orchestrated the murder of 30 loyal soldiers, who had tried to kill a king who was willing to throw his own daughter to the wolves to save his legacy. "You were supposed to marry the Alpha, secure this territory as a staging ground, and keep your mouth shut," Aldrich snarled. "Instead, you got yourself caught because you couldn't control your jealousy. Worthless just like your mother." Take her to the wagon," Theron ordered his guards, completely ignoring Seraphina's screams. "Throw her into the cage with her father. They will both hang from the walls of the capital at dawn, 4 days hence, once the royal procession reaches the Winter Palace and the traitors face formal tribunal before the assembled lords." He looked back at Gareth, his expression hardening even further. "Let every noble in the realm witness what becomes of those who plot regicide." As Seraphina was dragged away, kicking and screaming her father's name, her pleas turning to curses, Theron finally turned his full, terrifying attention back to Gareth. Gareth was shaking violently, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He had allowed the daughter of a traitor into his bed, had nearly allowed his pack to be poisoned by her vanity and ambition, and had publicly banished the king's fated mate based on fabricated evidence. By the ancient laws of the Lycan courts that still held absolute authority, Gareth's life was forfeit. He had to know that. I could see it in his eyes, the understanding that he was standing on the edge of his own grave. "I trusted you, Gareth," I said quietly, stepping slightly out from beneath Theron's heavy cloak, though I kept my hand firmly interlocked with the king's. My voice was soft, but it carried clearly in the frozen silence. "When I came to this pack 3 years ago, an orphan with nothing but the knowledge in my head and the herbs in my gathering basket, I swore an oath to heal your people." I looked around at the faces I'd known for years, the mothers and fathers, the warriors and elders, the children I'd delivered, and the sick I'd tended. "I saved your warriors when they fell in training. I birthed your pups and made sure both mothers and babies survived. I eased your elders' pains so they could live out their final years in comfort rather than agony." My voice hardened. "But the moment a woman with gold in her pockets and a pretty face whispered lies into your ear, you didn't investigate. You didn't question. You didn't even ask me for my side of the story before you shackled me and condemned me to death." I looked directly at Gareth, holding his gaze. "You threw me to the wolves, Gareth, literally. And you never once considered that you might be wrong." Gareth fell to his knees again, and this time there was no pride in the gesture, no calculation. Tears of genuine terror and regret streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the dirt and mud. "Maren," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Queen Maren, please." I was blinded by Seraphina's beauty, by her father's wealth, by my own pride and stupidity. "I am a fool, just as the king said, but I am begging you have mercy on my pack. They followed my orders. They trusted my judgment. Don't punish them for my failures. Your pack will not be harmed." Theron stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority that left no room for argument. "The innocent people of Frostpine who were fed lies and manipulated by their leaders will not suffer for the sins of their alpha. They will be brought under direct crown protection until a suitable replacement can be installed." He drew his broadsword, and the sound of the steel sliding from its scabbard was a crisp, metallic hiss that cut through the courtyard like a blade through silk. The weapon was massive, almost as tall as I was, forged from dark Valyrian steel that seemed to drink in the weak winter light. Ancient runes glowed along the blade's length with a faint blue luminescence pulsing in time with Theron's heartbeat. "But you, Gareth Stoneclaw," Theron declared, raising the massive blade, "are entirely unworthy of the title of Alpha." He drove the point of the sword into the frozen earth between Gareth's kneeling form and the gates, the blade sinking 6 inches into the hard ground as easily as if it were soft clay. "By the right of the crown and by the blood of the moon goddess, I strip you of your alpha status. You are no longer the leader of Frostpine. You are no longer a wolf of standing. You are stripped of your lands, your titles, and your honor. You are Omega, now the lowest of the low, with no pack and no name." Gareth bowed his head, weeping silently into the snow, accepting his utter ruin. I felt a twinge of something, not quite pity, but an acknowledgement of how far he had fallen. This morning he had been an alpha, respected and feared. Now he was nothing. "Dorian," Theron commanded, his voice cutting through Gareth's quiet sobs. "Take Gareth Stoneclaw to the northern borders. He is banished. Let him see how long he survives in the winter wastes with nothing but the clothes on his back. It was poetic, brutal justice. The exact fate Gareth had condemned me to less than an hour ago was now his own. Dorian moved forward and hauled the weeping ex-alpha to his feet with no gentleness, dragging him toward the gates like a sack of grain. As Gareth was led away, Theron turned to face the shocked, shivering masses of the Frostpine pack. He drove the tip of his broadsword deeper into the frozen earth and looked at them with eyes that burned like molten silver. "Marin Ironheart is your queen," he roared, his voice echoing across the mountains, bouncing off the stone walls, carrying for miles through the frozen air. Birds took flight from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled in response. "She is the heart of the northern reaches, blessed by the moon goddess herself as my fated mate. If any man, woman, or wolf ever speaks a word against her again, if anyone raises a hand to her or questions her authority, I will return to this territory, and I will leave nothing but ash and bones." The silence that followed the king's declaration was profound, heavy with the scent of fear and awe and the biting ozone of an alpha's absolute dominance. The Frostpine pack, hundreds of them, remained kneeling in the freezing slush. Elder Rowan pressed his forehead so hard against the ice that I feared he might actually crack his skull open. Theron sheathed his massive broadsword with a metallic ring that made the wolves in the front row visibly flinch. Then he turned to me, and just like that, the lethal monster melted away like frost in sunlight. He reached out and gently wiped a snowflake from my eyelashes, his touch impossibly tender. "My queen," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive rumble meant only for my ears. "Your home is secure, your name is cleared. What is your command for these people?" Before I could answer, before I could even process the enormity of what had just happened, a sound shattered the stillness. It was a war horn, but it didn't carry the deep, resonant bellow of the Royal Guard's instruments, nor the sharp, high pitch of Frostpine's sentries. This was a guttural, scraping blast that sounded like metal tearing against bone, like a scream forced through a brass throat. The sound echoed from the eastern ridge, cutting through the howling winter wind like a knife. In his rusted iron cage, Lord Aldrich Ravencrest began to laugh. The sound was wet and broken, bubbling up from a throat bruised by his captors and rough handling, but it was genuine, the laugh of a man who still had one card left to play. "Did you think," Aldrich coughed, spitting a glob of dark blood onto the floor of the wagon, "did you really think I would travel into the north without an insurance policy, you arrogant whelp?" He gripped the bars with his one remaining hand, pulling himself close enough that I could see the mad gleam in his eye. I knew the risks of the silver trade. I knew the king's hounds were sniffing around my borders. "I'm not a fool." Theron's entire posture shifted in an instant. His shoulders tensed beneath his armor, and he stepped in front of me, his body a shield between me and whatever was coming from the east. "Dorian!" Theron barked, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "Report." Now, Dorian, who had just returned from escorting Gareth to the boundary line, leaped onto the highest battlement with inhuman speed. He peered through the thick gray fog that was rolling down from the mountains, like a living thing, his one good eye scanning the tree line. "Sire," he called down, his scarred face grim. "Movement on the eastern ridge, heavy infantry advancing fast, multiple columns. They aren't flying a noble banner." He paused, squinting into the distance. "They bear the mark of the chained hound." A collective gasp rippled through the older pack members, the ones who had lived long enough to hear the stories to know what that symbol meant. "The Iron Hounds," someone whispered, and the words spread through the crowd like plague. They were a legendary mercenary company from the eastern Deadlands, composed of rogues and exiles and murderers who had been cast out from every respectable pack in the territories. They fought for nothing but gold and blood, took no prisoners, honored no treaties. They were savage and efficient, and they had never lost a contract. "Captain Varopen," Aldrich wheezed from his cage, his eyes alight with desperate, mad triumph. "I paid him triple his usual rate plus a bonus of Ravencrest silver. His orders were simple. If my daughter and I did not send a raven from this fortress by midday today, he was to descend upon Frostpine's slaughter. Every wolf inside, down to the last pup, and burn the castle to the foundation to destroy all evidence of my presence here." His remaining eye fixed on Seraphina, who was sobbing in the corner of the cage they now shared. "I'm sorry, my sweet daughter, but some sacrifices must be made. The Ravencrest legacy must survive, even if we do not." "Father, no," Seraphina wailed, throwing herself against the bars. "I'm still in here. They'll kill me, too. You can't." "Form ranks!" Theron roared, his voice shattering the rising panic like a hammer through glass. "Now." Instantly, the royal guard moved with the precision of a machine. The massive black-armored direwolves formed a secondary defensive wall around the gates, their formation tightening into an impenetrable barrier of steel and fur and fang. Behind them, Frostpine's warriors scrambled to retrieve their dropped weapons, realizing with sudden clarity that their only hope of survival lay in fighting alongside the king they had just spectacularly offended. "Protect the queen," Theron ordered, gesturing sharply to three of his largest guards. They immediately formed a tight triangle around me, their massive bodies blocking me from every angle. I could barely see past their armored shoulders. Theron turned to me, his expression grave but his eyes holding absolute certainty. "Maren, get to the keep. Get the elders and the pups into the deep cellars. Bar the doors and don't come out until I come for you." "No," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. Theron's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, he wasn't used to being told no. "Maren, if Captain Varro is leading them," I interrupted, my healer's mind already racing through possibilities and threats, "they won't just use steel. The Iron Hounds are known for using alchemical warfare. They use Wolf's Bane vapor." I saw the moment understanding hit Theron, his face going hard as stone. Wolf's Bane, when burned, had created a toxic smoke that could paralyze a werewolf's respiratory system and force them out of their shifted forms, leaving them completely vulnerable to conventional weapons. It was a brutal, effective tactic against even the strongest wolves. I grabbed the lapels of Theron's armor, forcing him to look at me, to really see me. "I am a healer, Theron. I know the countermeasures. I can brew a neutralizing agent. The winter moss and dried charcoal in my apothecary can absorb the toxins if burned in the courtyard braziers, but I need time to mix it properly." Theron stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the instinct to protect his mate battling against the tactical reality that I was offering a solution that could save hundreds of lives. Finally, a fierce burning pride lit up his silver eyes, transforming his face. He leaned down and pressed a hard, bruising kiss to my lips. Not gentle, not tender, but a promise sealed in blood and fire. "I will hold the gates," he said against my mouth. "You saved my men." Then he was gone, charging toward the front lines with his sword blazing with those ancient blue runes, his war cry echoing like thunder across the courtyard. And I ran not away from the danger, but toward my apothecary, toward the tools and knowledge that might be the difference between victory and massacre. I sprinted back across the courtyard toward my apothecary, my breath coming in sharp gasps that turned to white fog in the frozen air. Behind me, I could hear Theron's voice booming orders, the clash of steel as weapons were distributed, the howls of wolves shifting into their combat forms. And underneath it all, growing louder by the second, was the rhythmic thunder of hundreds of boots marching in perfect unison. The Iron Hounds were coming, and they were coming fast. I burst through the door of my apothecary and immediately began pulling jars from the shelves with shaking hands. Winter moss, the silvery green variety that grew on the north side of White Pines, crushed limestone from the quarries near the southern border, activated charcoal that I'd prepared last autumn from hardwood ash. I was dumping ingredients onto my workbench when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun knife already in my hand, but it was Alara Whitlock and Rowena, another pack mother, whose twins I delivered 2 years ago. They stood in the doorway, their faces pale and frightened, but determined. "Tell us what to do," Alara said simply. I didn't have time to question their change of heart, didn't have the luxury of holding grudges. I pointed to the forge building across the courtyard. "Every burlap sack of charcoal you can carry. Bring them here. Now, go." They ran, and I turned back to my work. The neutralizing compound required precise measurements, too little, and it wouldn't counteract the wolf's bane too much, and it would create its own toxic fumes. My hands moved with automatic precision, grinding the moss and limestone into the charcoal with my largest mortar and pestle, creating a volatile black powder that smelled like burnt earth in winter. Outside, the sounds of battle preparation intensified. I could hear the screech of metal on stone as swords were sharpened, the snap and pop of bones, as more wolves shifted the nervous whickers of horses being led to the stables. And then cutting through everything else came the first scream. I froze my hands, stilling on the pestle. The sound had come from the eastern wall high, and terrified and abruptly cut off. They were here. Alara and Rowena burst back through the door, each hauling a heavy sack of charcoal that left black smudges on their arms and clothes. More women followed, pack mothers and daughters, healers in training, who I'd taught over the years. Even a few of the younger warriors who were too injured to fight on the front lines. "Pack it into kegs," I ordered, pointing to the small wooden barrels I used for storing dried herbs. "Fill them 3/4 full, no more, or they'll be too heavy to throw." We need at least a dozen. They worked without question, their hands moving in controlled panic as the sounds of fighting grew closer. I could hear steel ringing against steel now, the snarls of wolves locked in combat, the screams of dying men and beasts. And underneath it all, a new sound began to creep into the air, a sickly sweet odor that made my nose burn and my eyes water. The vapor. I cursed, recognizing the scent immediately. Wolf's bane mixed with accelerant, probably oil, to make it burn faster and spread farther. They've breached the outer wall. They're already burning it. We worked faster, but my hands were shaking now. Through the small window of my apothecary, I could see thick purple-tinged smoke beginning to pour over the battlements, rolling down into the courtyard like a toxic fog. The first coughs started immediately. Frostpine warriors who had been fighting in their wolf forms suddenly shifted back to human, clutching at their throats, their respiratory systems seizing up from the poison. They collapsed into the snow, easy targets for the Iron Hounds' silver-tipped spears. Even Theron's royal guard, massive and powerful as they were, began to stagger. I saw one of the giant direwolves stumble, shaking its massive head, as if trying to clear the fog from its lungs. Another shifted back to human form, mid-battle, leaving the warrior vulnerable as a mercenary's blade found his exposed ribs. And Theron, I could see him in the thick of the fighting, his black armor splattered with blood that wasn't his sword swinging in devastating arcs that dropped 2 men with each stroke. But he was coughing thick lines of black blood dripping from his nose as the wolf's bane ravaged even his powerful lungs. A hulking mercenary with a scarred iron mask covering half his face raised a heavy crossbow. The bolt was loaded, the string drawn back, and it was aimed directly at Theron's back while he was occupied, cutting down 3 attackers at once. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the mercenary's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Theron turn too late, his sword committed to a different target. "Theron!" I screamed, even though I knew he couldn't hear me over the chaos of battle. I grabbed the nearest keg of neutralizing powder. It was only half full, not properly sealed, but there was no time, and I ran. Burst through the apothecary door, sprinted across the courtyard with my healer's bag bouncing against my hip and the keg clutched to my chest. There was a burning wagon between me and Theron, one of the merchant carts that had been caught in the initial attack. It was belching thick black smoke, adding to the toxic fog. I didn't think. I just threw. The keg sailed through the air in a perfect arc and shattered against the burning wagon. There was a loud, hollow whoosh as the neutralizing powder hit the flames. A thick white cloud erupted outward like a thunderclap, the pulverized limestone and winter moss reacting with the heat in an instantaneous chemical reaction. The purple wolf's bane vapor was swallowed whole, the toxic smoke replaced by the sharp grounding scent of chalk and pine. The air snapped clean in a visible wave spreading outward from the burning wagon. The crossbow bolt fired, but the sudden change in air pressure threw off the mercenary's aim. The bolt flew wide, missing Theron by inches, and buried itself in a wooden post behind him. Theron spun around, his silver eyes flashing as he saw me standing in the middle of the courtyard with soot on my face and a second keg in my arms. A terrifying feral grin spread across his bloodied face. His lungs cleared. His power dampened by the poison returned with a vengeance that I felt through the mate bond, like a surge of electricity through my veins. And Theron Ironheart Ulfred, king of the Northern Reaches, did not just fight as a man. He shifted. The transformation was explosive, a violent visceral tearing of muscle and bone and sinew. His human form literally ripped apart as his wolf surged forward, too powerful and too large to emerge gently. Within seconds, a monstrous 8-foot-tall direwolf composed of pure midnight black muscle and armored fur stood where the man had been. The beast's eyes glowed with the same silver fire, but magnified 100-fold. Each paw was the size of a warrior's shield, tipped with claws like curved daggers. Teeth as long as my forearm gleamed white against the black fur. This was the creature that had made the northern reaches into an empire. This was the winter's scythe. Theron's wolf threw back its massive head and roared, not howled, roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the earth. The ground trembled. The castle walls vibrated. Several of the Iron Hounds' horses screamed and bolted, throwing their riders. Then the king was among the mercenaries, and it wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. I watched, frozen in a mixture of awe and terror, as Theron tore through the Iron Hounds' front line like they were made of paper. He moved with a speed that should have been impossible for something so massive, a blur of black fur and flashing steel armor and spraying blood. The mercenary with the crossbow didn't even have time to reload before Theron's jaws closed around his torso. There was a sickening crunch, and the man went flying, landing 30 feet away and not moving again. "Queen Maren," Ilara's voice snapped me out of my horrified trance. She and the other women had followed me out of the apothecary, each carrying a keg of neutralizing powder. Tell us where to throw them. I forced my mind back to tactical thinking. The braziers, I shouted, pointing to the large iron fire pits that were stationed around the courtyard for warmth. And any active fires the mercenaries have set, the powder needs heat to activate. They scattered, running through the chaos of battle with a courage I wouldn't have believed possible an hour ago. Ilara hurled her keg into the nearest brazier, and another cloud of white smoke erupted, pushing back the purple poison fog. Rowena threw hers at a burning section of the wooden palisade, and the wolfsbane vapor that had been concentrated there dissipated like morning mist. With the poison neutralized, Theron's royal guard recovered rapidly. The massive direwolves shook off the effects of the toxin and surged back into the fight with renewed fury. Led by their monstrous king, they tore through the Iron Hounds with a brutality that would be sung about for generations. I saw Dorian Blackfang in his scarred gray wolf form drag down 3 mercenaries at once, his jaws snapping with bone-crushing force. I saw Captain Varro himself, a grizzled veteran with more scars than skin, try to rally his men for a final stand at the gates. Theron crushed him beneath one massive paw before he could even draw his secondary blade. Seeing their leader fall, and their chemical warfare rendered useless by what they probably thought was just a healer with some clever herbs, the remaining Iron Hounds broke ranks and fled toward the tree line. They didn't make it far. Dorian and a detachment of the fastest royal wolves pursued them into the deep snow, hunting them down with ruthless efficiency. The message was clear. No one who had raised a weapon against the queen would survive to tell the tale. When the smoke finally began to clear, both the toxic purple vapor and the white clouds of neutralizing compound, the courtyard of Frostpine was painted in crimson and ash. Bodies lay scattered across the snow, most wearing the ragged furs and mismatched armor of mercenaries, though there were some in the black steel of the royal guard as well. The price of victory was never bloodless. I stood near the apothecary, my chest heaving with exhaustion, leaning heavily against the cold stone wall. The adrenaline that had carried me through the last hour was fading rapidly, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made my legs shake. The massive black direwolf, that was, a Theron, padded slowly across the courtyard toward me, its enormous paws somehow silent on the blood-soaked snow. The beast was terrifying, up close, muzzle-stained red armor, dented and scratched from battle, those ruby inset plates gleaming in the pale winter light like captured stars. But as it approached, the monster lowered its massive head and let out a soft, vibrating whine that resonated directly against my soul through the mate bond. The sound was achingly gentle, at complete odds with the destruction this creature had just wrought. I reached out with soot-stained, trembling hands and buried them in the thick, coarse fur at the base of the wolf's neck. The fur was warm despite the freezing air, and I could feel the rapid thunder of Theron's heartbeat beneath muscle and bone. In a fluid, seamless motion that was somehow more unsettling than the violent shift into wolf form, the massive beast melted away. Bones reformed with soft pops instead of violent cracks. Fur receded into skin, and within seconds Theron stood before me in his human form. His chest was heaving with exertion, his steel armor covered in gore and dented in a dozen places. There was a deep gash across his left shoulder that was already closing his wolf's healing factor working overtime. Blood, not all of it, his was splattered across his face and matted in his dark hair. But he was alive, whole, victorious. He didn't care that half his army was watching, didn't care that we were surrounded by the dead and dying. He pulled me flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around me so tightly I could barely breathe, and buried his face in the crook of my neck. I felt his breath hot against my skin, felt the violent trembling that ran through his powerful frame, the aftermath of battle rage and terror for my safety finally catching up to him. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice rough and raw. "Again, you ran into the middle of a battle and saved my life. Again." Despite my exhaustion, despite the horror of what I just witnessed, I felt a tired smile touch my lips. "You were 40 minutes late," I whispered back, wrapping my arms around his waist as tightly as I could. "I had to do something with my time." A deep, rumbling laugh shook his chest, vibrating through mine, where we were pressed together. He pulled back just enough to look at me, really look at me, his silver eyes scanning my face for injuries with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Then he kissed me. Not the quick, promising kiss from before the battle. This was slow and deep, and claiming his hand coming up to cup the back of my head, his lips moving against mine, with a desperate hunger that spoke of how close we'd both come to losing each other. When we finally parted, both breathing hard, I could hear the absolute silence that had fallen over the courtyard. Every surviving member of Frostpine Pack, every royal guard was staring at us, with expressions ranging from awe to shock to dawning understanding. The king had just publicly sealed the mate bond before an army. There would be no question now, no room for doubt or political maneuvering. I was his queen, chosen by the moon goddess herself, and he had just announced it to the world in the most primal way possible. Theron turned his attention to the surviving members of the Frostpine Pack, keeping one arm wrapped protectively around my waist. They were battered and bleeding as their territory bearer damaged their alpha stripped and banished their future uncertain. But they were alive, and that was more than could be said for the Iron Hounds who had attacked them. Elder Rowan Greystone limped forward, supported by a younger wolf whose name I couldn't remember. The old man's face was bruised, blood seeping from a gash above his eye, but he was on his feet. He dropped to his knees in front of us, not out of fear this time, but out of profound, genuine reverence. "Your Majesty," Rowan croaked, looking at me with tears streaming down his ancient, weathered face. "My queen, we cast you out. We condemned you to die in the ice. We believed lies and refused to see the truth even when it was right in front of us." His voice broke. "And in return, you saved our lives. You could have run, could have let us face the consequences of our own stupidity and cruelty. But you came back. You risked yourself to save us." He pressed his forehead to the ground, his whole body shaking. "The Frostpine Pack owes you an unpayable debt. We are yours body and soul until the moon goddess calls us home." I looked at the kneeling elder, at the pack members beyond him, who were slowly sinking to their knees in the snow, and I felt something shift in my chest. An hour ago, these people had watched me be condemned. They had thrown mud and insults. They had turned their backs when I needed them most. But they were also the people I had served for 3 years. The mothers whose children I'd saved, the warriors whose wounds I'd closed, the elders whose pain I'd eased. They had been manipulated and lied to, ruled by a weak alpha who valued political alliance over truth. They deserved better than Gareth had given them. I stepped out of Theron's protective embrace, though I kept my hand firmly locked with his. "Stand up, Rowan," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I didn't save you for your loyalty or your gratitude. I saved you because I am a healer, and it's what I do. It's what I've always done, what I will always do." I looked around at the devastation, at the smoke still rising from burned buildings, at the bodies being carried away by the survivors. But this pack needs a new alpha, a true leader who will protect his people rather than using them as pawns in political games. Someone who values truth over appearances, substance over flattery. My eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a tall, broad-shouldered wolf standing near the gates. Callum Ironwood had fought like a demon during the battle, and even now, still bleeding from a dozen wounds, he was helping carry injured pack members to shelter, rather than tending to his own injuries. "Callum Ironwood," I called out. The guard's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock. He limped forward and immediately dropped to one knee, his fist pressed to his heart in the old gesture of fealty. "You fought with honor today," I said, looking to Theron for confirmation. The king gave me a firm nod of approval, trusting my judgment. "You protected the weak, inspired your fellow warriors, and never once broke formation, even when the battle turned against us." I felt Theron's power flow through our joined hands as he lent his authority to my words. "By the authority of the crown, we name you the new Alpha of Frostpine. Rebuild this fortress. Care for your elders and your pups. Train your warriors. And never, never let a pack member be condemned without absolute, undeniable proof of their crimes." Callum's eyes were shining with a mixture of shock, pride, and fierce determination. "I swear it upon my life and my wolf queen Maren," he said, his voice ringing clear and strong. "I will lead Frostpine with honor. I will protect our people. I will never let injustice stand unchallenged. This I vow before the moon goddess and the Alpha King." The pack erupted in howls, not of celebration, but of acceptance and relief. They had a leader again, one chosen not by political alliance or inheritance, but by merit and the blessing of the crown. The matter was settled. Theron whistled sharply, and his massive royal stallion was brought forward by one of the guards. The beast was enormous, easily 17 hands high, with a coat as black as Theron's wolf form and eyes that held an intelligence that was almost unsettling. Theron mounted the beast with effortless grace despite his injuries and fatigue, then reached down with one powerful arm. His hand closed around my waist, and he lifted me as easily as if I weighed nothing, pulling me up into the saddle in front of him. He wrapped his heavy royal cloak around both of us, securing me against the cold and against his chest. I could feel his heartbeat against my spine, strong and steady and alive. "Are you ready to go home, little bird?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the crown of my head. I looked back at the stone apothecary, at the high fortress walls, at the people who were now bowing in genuine respect rather than mockery. It was a life I was leaving behind, 3 years of service and struggle and loneliness. But for the first time since I'd stumbled into Frostpine territory as a half-starved orphan, I wasn't being cast out. I was rising. "I am," I whispered. The victory horns blew deep resonant sounds that echoed off the mountains and announced to all the territories that the Alpha King rode home triumphant. And as the royal procession began to march out of the heavy iron gates of Frostpine, heading north toward the distant Winter Palace, I rested my head against Theron's chest and listened to the steady, unyielding beat of his heart. The hourglass that had counted down to my death had instead marked the beginning of my reign. I stood on the highest balcony of the Winter Palace, the heavy silver crown of the northern reaches resting securely upon my brow. The weight of it had felt strange at first, too heavy, too prominent, too much. But after 6 months, it had become as natural as breathing. It was late summer now, the Montana wilderness below the palace transformed from the frozen wasteland I remembered into a landscape of green valleys and flowering meadows. But even in the warmest months, the peaks of the Blowood Mountains in the distance remained snow-capped, reminding everyone why Theron's seat of power was called the Winter Palace. A year had passed since that freezing afternoon in Frostpine, since an hourglass had nearly marked my death instead of my ascension. 12 months since I'd knelt in chains before an alpha who couldn't see past his own pride and ambition. Sometimes it still felt like a dream, like I would wake up in my cramped apothecary room and find that none of this was real. But then I would feel the mate bond humming in my chest like a second heartbeat, warm and constant, and I would know that this was my life now. Down in the courtyard far below, Theron trained with his elite guard in the afternoon sun. Even from this height, I could make out his distinctive form broader through the shoulders than any of his men, moving with a lethal grace that made the practice combat look like a deadly dance. As if he could sense my gaze, he looked up. Our eyes met across the distance, and I felt the mate bond pulse with warmth and affection. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming him from the fearsome winter's scythe into the man who held me close at night and whispered promises against my skin. "How is our little wolf today?" The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see Dorian Blackfang standing in the doorway to the balcony. His scarred face was carefully neutral, but I'd learned to read the subtle softening around his one good eye that meant he was pleased about something. I placed my hand over my swollen belly, 6 months pregnant and showing prominently now, despite the flowing gowns I'd taken to wearing. Restless, just like his father. "Or her mother," Dorian countered with a rare smile. "The healers still can't tell. They say the pup is hiding," I said, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath my palm. "Won't shift position enough for them to determine sex. Stubborn already. Definitely gets that from both parents then." Dorian stepped out onto the balcony properly, a stack of documents in his hands. The quarterly reports from the territories. "You asked to see them before they went to Theron." I took the papers gratefully, settling into the cushioned chair that Theron had ordered placed on the balcony after he'd found me standing for hours at a time during my first trimester. The reports made for interesting reading. Frostpine territory was thriving under Callum Ironwood's leadership. The fortress had been rebuilt stronger than before with new defensive walls and updated infrastructure. More importantly, the social reforms I'd insisted upon had taken root. No alpha could issue a banishment without a council vote of at least 7 elders. Healers had been granted protected status. They couldn't be accused of crimes without a medical peer review board examining the evidence. Evidence standards had been raised across all pact territories under Crown authority, requiring 3 independent witnesses and physical proof inspected by a neutral party. And perhaps most importantly, quarterly justice audits were now conducted by royal inspectors who visited each pack to review recent verdicts and ensure the new laws were being followed. It was slow work changing systems that had been in place for centuries, but it was working. "What about the Ravencrest estate?" I asked, flipping through the documents until I found the relevant section. "Fully seized by the Crown as ordered," Dorian reported. "The wealth has been redistributed to the families of the guards who were killed in the ambush on King Theron. The silver mines are now under direct Crown operation, with the profits going to the treasury instead of enriching traitors." He paused, his expression darkening slightly. "The eastern valleys are under direct Crown oversight now. Some of the other noble families grumbled at first, but after Lord Aldrich's execution, they've been remarkably cooperative." The execution. I hadn't attended, though Theron had offered to delay it until I felt well enough to travel in my early pregnancy. But I told him I didn't need to see it. I'd read the official report instead. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest and his daughter Seraphina had been hanged at dawn from the walls of the Winter Palace, their bodies displayed for 3 days as a warning to any other nobles who might consider treason. It should have bothered me more, perhaps. The woman who had tried to frame me, who had stood by and watched me be condemned, had died choking at the end of a rope. But I couldn't find it in myself to mourn her. She had made her choices just as her father had made his. Justice had been served. The realm was safer for it. And the Healer Academy, I asked, turning to a section that made me smile despite the grim topic we'd just been discussing. Enrollment has exceeded all expectations, Dorian said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. 73 students in the first class alone, with waiting lists for the next 3 terms. Your personal funding has covered the initial costs, but the Crown has allocated additional resources to expand the facilities. The Academy had been my first major project as Queen. I'd used my portion of the seized Ravencrest wealth. Theron had insisted I was entitled to compensation for the attempt on my life to establish a school for healers in the territory between Frostpine and the Winter Palace. But it wasn't just a school for medicine and herbs. The Academy also taught literacy, mathematics, basic law, and self-defense. It accepted students regardless of their rank within pack hierarchies. Alphas, betas, and omegas learned side by side, united by their calling to heal. And most importantly, it gave orphaned omegas, like I had once been, a path forward, a way to earn respect through skill rather than hoping for the rare blessing of a powerful mate. The first graduating class will be ready for placement in 6 months, Dorian continued. We've already received requests from 15 different packs asking for trained healers. Apparently, word has spread about the quality of education. I felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with the crown on my head or the title before my name. This was mine. This was the legacy I was building, one that would outlast any single reign, any single generation. A legacy that ensured no other Omega would have to face an hourglass countdown alone. Your Majesty. The voice was soft, hesitant. I turned to see one of the palace servants, a young woman named Lyra, standing at the balcony entrance. The king is finished with training. He's asking if you'll join him for the evening meal. Tell him I'll be there shortly, I said, rising carefully from my chair. The added weight of pregnancy made even simple movements require more thought, more balance. I need to change first. The servant bowed and hurried away. Dorian offered his arm to help steady me as we walked back into the palace proper, and I took it gratefully. For all his fearsome reputation, Dorian had become something of a protective uncle to me over the past months. Oh, one more thing, Dorian said as we walked through the corridors toward my chambers. The envoys from the Western Territories finally sent their formal response to your proposal about standardizing justice protocols across all the packs. I looked at him expectantly. The Western Territories had been the most resistant to change, clinging to their old ways and old privileges. They've agreed to a trial implementation, Dorian said, his scarred face breaking into a genuine grin. 6 months with quarterly reviews. If the results are positive, they'll adopt the full reforms. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Pregnancy had made me embarrassingly emotional, but these were tears of joy. That's everyone then. All the major territories are on board. You're changing the world, little queen, Dorian said softly. One law at a time. My chambers were in the southern wing of the palace with windows that overlooked the valley and caught the afternoon sun. Theron's chambers were connected to mine by a shared sitting room, though in practice we rarely used our separate bedrooms anymore. I changed out of my formal day gown and into something simpler, but still befitting my station, the flowing dress in deep blue that accommodated my pregnant belly while still maintaining the regal bearing expected of a queen. I left my hair down rather than pinned up in the elaborate styles the court preferred, knowing that Theron liked it better that way. When I entered the private dining room, Theron was already there, freshly bathed and changed out of his training leathers into a simple tunic and trousers. He looked younger like this, more relaxed, the weight of kingship temporarily set aside. He stood when I entered, his eyes lighting up with that particular warmth he reserved only for me. You're glowing, he said, pulling out my chair before taking his own seat across the small table. I'm sweating, I corrected with a laugh. It's summer, I'm 6 months pregnant, and whoever designed these formal gowns clearly never considered that queens might actually need to move. Then we'll commission new ones, Theron said immediately. I'll have the royal tailors. You will do no such thing, I interrupted, reaching across the table to take his hand. I'm fine. I'm just complaining because I can. It's a pregnant woman's prerogative. He brought my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. How was your day, my queen? I told him about the reports about the Western Territories finally agreeing to the trial implementation, about the Healer Academy's enrollment numbers. He listened with genuine interest, occasionally interjecting with questions or suggestions, treating my work as equal in importance to his own military and political concerns. This was what I loved most about our partnership, the mutual respect, the understanding that we each brought different strengths to our reign. Theron commanded armies and negotiated treaties. I reformed laws and built institutions. Together, we were creating something new. I have news as well, Theron said when I'd finished. The northern border territories have officially recognized our sovereignty. No more raids, no more disputed claims. The treaty was signed this morning. My eyes widened. Theron had been working on that particular diplomatic challenge since before we'd even met. That's incredible. That's every territory then. The entire northern reaches is finally united under the crown. Under our crown, Theron corrected, his eyes intense. This isn't my achievement alone, Marin. The northern clans respected strength, yes, but what finally convinced them was hearing about your reforms. About how you treated Frostpine after they condemned you with justice tempered by mercy, with systemic change rather than revenge. He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside my chair so that we were at eye level. His hand came to rest on my swollen belly, feeling the movement of our child beneath his palm. You are the heart of this realm, he said softly. I am the sword that protects it, but you are the reason it's worth protecting. Never forget that. I cupped his face in my hands, feeling the rough scratch of his beard against my palms. If we're cataloging achievements, you saved my life. Twice. First from Gareth's banishment, then from the Iron Hounds. I think that balances the scales. Barely, he said with a smile. You saved mine 3 times. Once in the cave, once with the crossbow, and once every single day when you choose to stay by my side despite all the danger and politics and chaos that comes with this life. Before I could respond, our child gave a particularly strong kick that made us both freeze. Theron's eyes went wide with wonder. It was the strongest movement, yet strong enough that he could feel it clearly through my belly. Definitely gets the stubbornness from both parents, I said with a laugh. We stayed like that for a long moment, his hand on my belly, my hands on his face, both of us marveling at the life we'd created together. A child who would be born into a realm transformed into a world where Omegas could become queens and justice wasn't dependent on the whims of cruel alphas. A child who would never have to face an hourglass countdown, who would never know what it felt like to be powerless and alone. Eventually, we ate our meal and talked of lighter things. Dorian's latest embarrassing attempts at courting one of the palace healers, the ongoing debate about whether to add a second wing to the Healer Academy, Callum's recent letter, asking advice about managing a particularly stubborn elder in Frostpine. As the sun set and the room filled with the warm glow of candlelight, I felt a profound sense of contentment. This was my life now. Not the desperate survival of my years as a wandering Omega, not the careful navigation of pack politics in Frostpine, but this partnership purpose piece. I've been thinking about names, Theron said, suddenly pulling me from my thoughts. Oh, I set down my wineglass water for me now, much to my annoyance, and gave him my full attention. If it's a girl, he said, his voice soft, I want to name her Ilara, after the woman who helped you in the apothecary that day, the one who overcame her fear to do the right thing. I felt my eyes prickle with tears again. Ilara Whitlock had written to me twice since I'd left Frostpine, apologizing for her cowardice during my trial, thanking me for saving the pack despite their treatment of me. Her letters had been raw and honest, and I'd written back each time offering forgiveness and understanding. That's perfect, I whispered. And if it's a boy, Theron continued, I thought, Rowan. After the elder who learned that even old wolves can change, that it's never too late to choose honor over fear. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Both names honored wolves who had failed me initially, but had found the courage to change, to stand up for what was right. It felt fitting given everything we were trying to build. Ilara Ironheart or Rowan Ironheart, I said, testing the names. Both sound like they belong to someone who will change the world. Just like their mother, Theron said, standing and pulling me gently to my feet. Come, it's been a long day. Let's retire. We walked through the palace corridors together, his arm around my waist to support my awkward pregnant waddle, my head resting against his shoulder. Guards and servants bowed as we passed, but they also smiled genuine smiles of affection rather than fearful respect. We had earned their loyalty not through fear or dominance, but through fair rule and genuine care for our people. It was a fragile thing, still new and untested in many ways, but it was real. In our shared chambers, Theron helped me out of my gown with gentle efficiency, his fingers unlacing the complicated fastenings with the ease of long practice. I changed into a soft sleeping gown, while he banked the fire and checked that the windows were secure habits from his years as a warrior that he'd never quite lost. When we finally settled into bed, I nestled against his chest with his arm wrapped protectively around me and his hand resting on my belly. Through the open window, I could hear the sounds of the palace settling for the night guards changing shifts, servants finishing their final tasks, the distant howl of a wolf greeting the rising moon. Marin, Theron's voice was quiet in the darkness. Do you ever regret it, sending that raven? You could have run, could have taken your chances in the wilderness. You didn't have to tie yourself to me, to all of this responsibility and danger. I was quiet for a moment, thinking back to that desperate day when I'd bribed a merchant with my mother's ring, knowing that the message I was sending would change my life forever. I regret nothing, I said finally. I was dying either way, slowly in the wilderness or quickly on Gareth's border. At least by sending the raven I had a chance. And I got so much more than that. I shifted so I could look up at him, seeing his silver eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. I got you. I got a purpose. I got the power to make sure no one else has to suffer what I suffered. I got a chance to change the world. I placed my hand over his on my belly. I got a future instead of an hourglass counting down to my death. So no, Theron Ironheart, I regret nothing. He kissed me, then slow and sweet and deep, pouring everything he couldn't say into the touch. When we parted, he pressed his forehead to mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. I love you, he whispered. My queen, my mate, my salvation. I love you too, I whispered back. My king, my protector, my home. We fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and the mate bond that hummed between us like a song. And if I dreamed of hourglasses and counting sand, I also dreamed of the moment the ground had shuddered and an army had emerged from the mist to save me. I dreamed of the moment I became the Winter's Queen. The dawn broke clear and bright over the Winter Palace 6 months later. I stood on the same balcony where I'd spent so many afternoons watching Theron train, but this time I held my newborn daughter in my arms. Alara Ironheart had been born at midnight under a full moon, her first cries strong and healthy. She had her father's silver eyes, and if the healers were to be believed, would grow up to have my dark hair. Theron stood beside me, one arm around my waist, the other hand gently stroking our daughter's soft cheek. Below us in the courtyard, the entire court had gathered to catch their first glimpse of the royal heir. People of the northern reaches, Theron called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard and beyond. I present to you Princess Alara Ironheart, heir to the winter throne, child of the wolf and the moon. The courtyard erupted in cheers and howls, the celebration echoing off the mountains and rolling across the valleys. Our daughter, startled by the noise, opened her silver eyes wide and looked up at us with an expression of such serious curiosity that I couldn't help but laugh. She's judging the quality of their howls, I said to Theron, already so discerning. Gets that from her mother, he said with a grin, pressing a kiss to my temple. I looked out over the assembled crowd, nobles and common wolves alike, alphas and omegas, standing shoulder to shoulder, united under a crown that had promised them justice and kept that promise. In the back, I could see a group of young women in the distinctive green robes of the Healer Academy watching with expressions of hope and determination. One of them caught my eye and smiled, placing her fist over her heart in the old gesture of fealty. I returned the gesture, and understanding rippled through the group. They knew. They understood what I had fought for, what I continued to fight for. A world where an orphaned Omega could become a queen, where healers were protected instead of condemned, where justice was based on evidence and truth instead of political convenience. We weren't there yet. There was still so much work to do, so many territories where the old ways held sway, so many hearts and minds that needed to be changed. But we had made a start. What are you thinking? Theron asked softly, his eyes on my face rather than the celebrating crowd. I looked down at our daughter, at her perfect tiny features and her bright, curious eyes. I thought about the hourglass that had counted down what should have been my last hour. I thought about the king who had arrived in 40 minutes instead of 60, who had transformed my death sentence into a coronation. I thought about the life I'd built from the ashes of condemnation, the laws I'd written, the students I'd taught, the world I was shaping for my daughter to inherit. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that I was supposed to die in the snow, discarded by a fool who couldn't see past gold and lies. But I didn't weep, I didn't beg. I sent a raven I trusted, the bond, and I fought for my life with the only weapons I had, knowledge, courage, and the unshakable belief that I was worth saving. I looked up at Theron, at the man who had seen my worth when I was at my lowest, who had given me not just salvation, but partnership, purpose, power. I'm thinking, I continued, that I'm no longer Marin Ashford the Stray. I'm Marin Ironheart, Queen of the Northern Reaches, and I will make sure no Omega ever faces an hourglass alone again. Theron's eyes shone with pride and love, and something deeper that had no name. Then let's build that world together, he said, echoing the promise he'd made months ago on this very balcony. Together, I agreed. Our daughter chose that moment to let out a small, imperious cry. Not distressed, just annoyed that she wasn't the center of attention. We both laughed, and I adjusted her in my arms, rocking her gently until she settled. Below us, the celebration continued. Above us, the sun rose higher, burning away the last remnants of frost from the palace walls. And between us, the mate bond hummed with contentment and purpose, and the knowledge that we had built something that would endure. I was given 60 minutes to pack my life and run. Instead, I became the Winter's Queen.